The stain didn't look like much at first, just a dark bloom on the white linen, irregular and careless. But the moment I saw it, something clenched inside my chest. The party was over, the guests long gone, and the living room sat in silence except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Yet that stain remained, vivid and fresh, like a secret left too close to the surface. I stood over it, staring, holding a damp cloth in my hand that I hadn't used yet, unable to decide whether I wanted to clean it or leave it there as a warning. There had been laughter that night, too. Too much wine, a few too many games. My wife had insisted we invite her best friend to stay after the others left. She's too tipsy to drive, she'd said, and I hadn't argued. The girl had laughed off the offer, but stayed anyway. Her cheeks flushed and her limbs relaxed in that loose, dangerous way alcohol can unravel a person. She had thrown herself onto the couch, wine glass in hand, eyes half-lidded, mouth curled into something between mischief and melancholy. I remember watching her and thinking she looked like someone who had just let go of a secret too heavy to hold any longer. I hadn't meant to be alone with her. My wife had gone to bed first, leaving behind a trail of lipstick on her wine glass and a murmur of good night that felt lighter than usual. I lingered in the kitchen, rinsing plates, stacking glasses, pretending that I didn't notice her friend sitting in the doorway, sipping slowly, staring. When I turned, she was looking right at me. Not in the casual, sloppy way drunk people do, but with an intensity that stripped the air bare. I paused, and so did she. The moment stretched and held its breath. I should have walked away. I should have said something to break the spell. Instead, I picked up her empty glass, filled it again, and handed it to her with hands that trembled just slightly. Her fingers brushed mine, and she didn't pull away. The space between us narrowed, not physically, but in that invisible way that makes everything feel louder. Breath, heartbeat, skin against fabric. She tilted her head, smiled slowly, and then she said it. It came out in a slurred whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. But I did. I caught every syllable. I understood every word. And I didn't forget them. Not the next morning, not the morning after that, not even now, standing alone in the dining room, the stain before me, the silence around me, the weight of those words sitting in the pit of my stomach like a stone. I touched the stain. The wine was sticky now, already beginning to set. The cloth in my hand remained dry. My body didn't want to clean it. My mind had drifted somewhere else entirely. I thought of the way she had looked at me, wide eyes, wet lashes, lips parted slightly like she was about to laugh or cry or maybe both. I thought of the way her voice had caught in her throat, like the confession had clawed its way out of her without permission. She had said things that no one should ever say to another woman's wife, not in a house that wasn't hers, not while the person she was speaking of lay asleep down the hall, but she had said them, and now I couldn't unhear them. I couldn't unfeel the way her gaze clung to me as she said them. She hadn't asked for a reply. She hadn't reached out. She had simply dropped the truth between us like a lit match on dry grass and let it burn. I had gone to bed after that, slowly, carefully, as though the air itself might break if I moved too fast. My wife had turned in her sleep as I slipped under the covers, murmuring something incoherent, her hand searching for mine beneath the blanket. I gave it to her, held it tight, as if that would steady the world that had tilted off axis just an hour before. I stared at the ceiling most of the night, unable to sleep, waiting for the morning to deliver clarity it never brought. Now it was the day after, and I was still looking at the stain. It seemed ridiculous, the way something so small could carry so much weight. It wasn't just wine. It was the moment it spilled, the laughter that preceded it, the glance she gave me as it happened, the words that tumbled out of her mouth minutes later. I remembered the way her voice shook slightly, even through the fog of alcohol. It didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like desperation. I walked away from the table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stood by the window. The street outside was quiet, clean, ordinary. Morning joggers, a barking dog, someone dragging their trash bin to the curb. But inside me, the world felt tilted, askew. The lines between memory and imagination were starting to blur. I couldn't tell if I had heard her say what she said because I wanted it to be true or because it was. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't ask her friend what she remembered. I didn't touch the stain again. I left it there all day, and then another. Every time I passed the dining room, I looked at it, and every time, something inside me stirred. Not guilt, not yet. Not desire, not exactly, but something. Something I hadn't expected. Something I wasn't ready to name. The morning arrived with deceptive calm. Sunlight stretched across the floor, falling in golden slats through the blinds, catching on the dust in the air like suspended glitter. I brewed coffee as usual, letting the aroma fill the kitchen, grounding myself in the ritual. But every sound seemed sharper, every detail exaggerated. The clink of mugs, the hum of the kettle, the scrape of a chair, each one amplified by the memory of what had happened the night before. I moved carefully, as if silence itself might betray me. She was still in the living room, curled on the couch, a blanket tangled around her legs. Her hair was a chaotic halo, falling across her face as she scrolled lazily on her phone. There was nothing unusual in the scene, yet I couldn't shake the awareness that hung between us like a thin thread. Her presence filled the room differently now. I could feel it pressing against my thoughts, against the rhythm of my breath. I carried the coffee into the room, placed it on the table, and avoided looking at her for too long. But I did look. I couldn't help it. The casual way she moved, the curve of her body beneath the blanket, the bare stretch of her thigh revealed as she shifted, all of it pulled my gaze like a magnet. I told myself I was only noticing because of her drunken confession, because my mind was restless and searching for signs. Yet when she laughed softly at something on her screen, a small, private laugh, my chest tightened. It wasn't just memory. It was her, the sound of her, the way it lingered in the air long after she'd quieted. We were alone. My wife had already left for work, her departure marked by the slam of the front door and the fading echo of her heels on the pavement. The house, usually filled with routine, suddenly felt cavernous, empty, except for the two of us. The thought unsettled me, though not because of danger. It was something else, an awareness of proximity, the sharp edge of temptation. I moved through the space slowly, trying to anchor myself in ordinary actions, but every motion felt charged, deliberate. She shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and glanced at me. Her eyes met mine for only a second, but the weight of that second lingered far longer. I looked away first, fixing my gaze on the mug in my hand, pretending to be absorbed in the swirl of steam. Yet the image of her eyes stayed with me, bright, questioning, too open. I felt exposed, as though she had seen the thoughts I was working so hard to bury. The silence thickened, not hostile, but dense, alive. I busied myself with the dishes, letting the sound of running water mask the rhythm of my breathing. Behind me, I could hear her shifting again, the couch creaking softly beneath her weight. Every sound she made seemed designed to remind me she was still there. I closed my eyes for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter, willing the tension to dissipate. But it didn't. It wrapped tighter around me, coiling, patient. I turned back to glance at her, and she was watching me, openly now, unashamed. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders, pooling in her lap. She didn't move to adjust it. The skin of her arm caught the light, warm and unguarded. I felt my throat tighten, my mouth dry. I forced myself to turn away again, to put a plate into the cabinet, to let the weight of porcelain distract me. But my mind kept circling back to her, to the way she looked at me like the night before hadn't been a mistake, like it had been the beginning of something neither of us could deny. I sat across from her at the table eventually, needing to break the invisible barrier of distance. She returned her attention to the magazine she had picked up, flipping through the pages with idle fingers, though her gaze flicked up now and then. I caught it once, twice, until it felt like we were engaged in a silent game of chase. Each time our eyes met, my heart gave a sharp, traitorous beat. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, just guilt. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, whether I wanted it to or not. The hours stretched out with unnatural slowness. Sunlight crept across the floorboards, inch by inch, while we drifted through the same rooms, orbiting each other like planets caught in gravitational pull. I made lunch without asking if she was hungry, placing a plate in front of her before sitting down with my own. She accepted it without a word, but her fingers brushed mine as she reached for the fork. It was nothing. It was everything. My skin tingled long after her hand moved away. I found myself noticing things I had overlooked before. The way she chewed thoughtfully, pausing between bites. The curve of her lips as she sipped water. The softness of her hair falling forward as she leaned over the table. None of it was extraordinary, and yet every detail pressed into me, carving space in my thoughts I hadn't given her before. The confession had cracked something open, and now I couldn't close it again. I was aware of her in a way I couldn't undo. Later, as the afternoon dimmed into early evening, I stood at the window, watching the sky bleed orange and pink. I felt her behind me before I heard her. The quiet rustle of her movements, the subtle warmth of her presence, the faint scent of her shampoo drifting closer. She stood a few feet away, not touching, not speaking, but near enough that I could feel her without turning. My shoulders stiffened, not from discomfort, but from the intensity of restraint. I didn't move, neither did she. The silence became a living thing between us. When she finally walked past me, her hand brushed lightly against my arm. It was unintentional. It was deliberate. My body reacted faster than my mind, heat rushing to my skin, heart stumbling. I stood there long after she left the room, staring at the fading light, my hand tingling where hers had touched it. The air smelled of dusk and possibility, and I knew then that the spark had already been struck. Whether it would burn quietly or blaze into something dangerous was no longer up to me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of her more than I thought of my wife. The thought unsettled me, scared me, but it also filled me with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I closed my eyes and tried to banish her image, but it stayed. Her eyes, her mouth, her laughter lingering like smoke after fire. The shadows in the room stretched long and restless, and in their silence, I realized that something irreversible had already begun. The evening unfolded with deceptive ease, as though nothing had changed, yet every moment carried an undercurrent that threatened to spill over. The lamp in the corner threw a warm pool of light across the living room, softening the edges of the furniture and cloaking us in intimacy we hadn't asked for but couldn't escape. She sat close, too close, her body angled toward mine as though unconsciously seeking heat. I felt the brush of her knee against mine, faint but unmistakable, and I didn't move away. That single point of contact seemed to grow larger with every passing second, filling my awareness until it drowned out everything else. The television played in the background, but I couldn't follow the story. The only story I knew was unfolding quietly between our bodies. Her hand rested on the cushion, inches from mine, and my fingers twitched with the weight of temptation. I told myself it was an accident, that the nearness was circumstantial, yet my pulse betrayed me. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, even without contact, as though the air itself carried it to me. My breathing slowed, shallower, drawn tight by a nervous anticipation that I could neither explain nor dismiss. I stared at her profile, the curve of her cheek illuminated by the lamplight, the delicate rise and fall of her chest. It was unbearable, and it was irresistible. I shifted slightly, as if adjusting my posture, but the movement brought our arms closer. The edge of her sleeve brushed against mine, a feather-light contact that sent an electric jolt through me. My body stiffened at first, unsure whether to pull back, but the sensation lingered, humming beneath my skin like a secret I was no longer able to keep. I let myself stay there, suspended on the precipice between innocence and betrayal, knowing that this was the point where everything could still be explained away or allowed to change forever. My mind argued, but my body leaned forward, betraying me with subtle gravity. When her fingers grazed the back of my hand, the air thickened instantly. It wasn't a grasp, not even a deliberate hold, but a fleeting brush, as though she had tested the boundary just to see if I would flinch. I didn't. My skin prickled, my stomach tightened, and my eyes dropped instinctively to the place where her touch had been. The space between us ceased to feel like space at all. It was alive, heavy, a veil waiting to be torn open. I sat perfectly still, terrified of breaking the moment, yet desperate for it to continue. The silence grew louder with every heartbeat. She leaned back casually, her head resting against the cushion, but her leg pressed more firmly against mine now, no longer by chance. The steady weight of it anchored me, grounded me, even as my thoughts scattered wildly. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that we were still safe inside the borders of friendship, yet the tension in my chest told me otherwise. The warmth spread up my thigh, into my hips, rising through my body like a slow, inevitable fire. I closed my eyes briefly, savoring and fearing it all at once. I glanced at her then, unable to resist, and caught her watching me. Her gaze was soft but unyielding, a wordless acknowledgement of what had passed between us. Neither of us smiled, neither of us looked away. The unspoken agreement hung there, fragile and potent, like a glass teetering on the edge of a table. My breath came uneven, shallow, and my hand twitched once more, as though longing to close the gap between us. For a moment, I thought she might take it. For a moment, I wished she would. The line had been crossed, but barely, and I sat inside the tremor of it long after the contact ended. I could still feel the echo of her fingers on my skin, the phantom weight of her thigh against mine, the way her gaze lingered like an imprint I couldn't erase. I moved eventually, rising to clear the glasses from the table, but the movements were mechanical, meaningless. My body was still on the couch, suspended in that charged moment, replaying it again and again. The line of touch had been drawn, faint but undeniable, and I knew that sooner or later it would demand to be followed further. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory returned with cruel persistence. The softness of her touch, the quiet certainty of her gaze, the warmth of her body beside mine. My wife slept soundly next to me, unaware, her breathing steady in the dark. I stared at the ceiling, my hand resting open on the sheet, still tingling from the ghost of contact. It was just a brush, a line, a moment, but it was enough to unravel everything I thought I had under control. Nights became heavier after that first brush of skin, as if the air in the house learned to remember what had happened between us. Darkness used to feel restful, a time to retreat and close my eyes. But now it felt alive, filled with possibilities I didn't dare name. The silence in each room was no longer empty. It hummed, restless, waiting. I moved through the halls as though the walls themselves were watching, holding on to secrets that grew hotter each time we crossed paths. Every glance, every pause carried weight until the whole house seemed to lean toward us, complicit in the fire we hadn't yet admitted was burning. The living room became our stage. We would sit on the couch with the television glowing faintly in front of us, but I couldn't tell you what shows we watched. My attention was fixed on the curve of her body, the tilt of her head, the way her laughter slipped into the spaces between us. She sprawled casually, her bare legs stretched across the cushions, her foot brushing against my thigh when she shifted. The contact was light, innocent in appearance, but my skin lit up each time as though she had branded me with flame. I pretended to adjust my posture, but the truth was I stayed still, craving every accidental touch. Sometimes she came into the kitchen late at night when I thought I was alone. I would stand at the counter, pouring water into a glass, and suddenly feel the warmth of her presence behind me. She didn't need to touch me. Her nearness was enough to stir something deep, a spark that spread through me in a rush of heat. She would brush past me to reach the fridge, her arm grazing mine, her shoulder brushing against my back. I stood frozen in those moments, pretending not to notice, but each time I replayed it later in the dark, my body shivered with memory. Clothing began to feel like a fragile barrier, one I was too aware of. She wore sleep shorts and loose shirts that slipped off her shoulders, revealing skin that glowed in the dim lamplight. I found myself staring when I shouldn't, my eyes tracing the line of her collarbone, the curve of her waist. When she bent to pick something up, I looked away too slowly, caught in the dangerous rhythm of desire that pulsed louder every day. My thoughts betrayed me, my body betrayed me, but the hunger only grew stronger. It wasn't a sudden blaze. It was a steady burn, quiet but consuming, licking at the edges of everything familiar until it threatened to swallow it whole. Our routine changed in ways subtle but undeniable. She lingered longer in doorways, her hand brushing the frame as though leaving a mark. I lingered longer in rooms when I knew she was near, my footsteps slowing, my heart racing. We no longer closed doors. I would find her stretched out on my bed when she borrowed a book, her body sprawled across the sheets as if testing the boundaries I refused to name. I didn't ask her to move. I didn't tell her to stop. The silence between us grew thick with acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't need words because the truth is already burning too brightly to ignore. One evening, she sat beside me on the couch, her body turned toward mine. A movie flickered in front of us, forgotten almost as soon as it began. Her hand rested on the back of the couch, inches from my shoulder, her thigh pressed against mine more firmly this time, no pretense of accident. I didn't move away. My hand slid onto the cushion between us, so close to hers that the heat of her skin bled into mine. We sat like that, not speaking, not moving, until the room itself seemed to breathe with us. My chest rose and fell, shallow and quick, while my mind repeated one desperate truth. I wanted her. The nights blurred into each other after that. The touches became bolder, the stares longer, the distance smaller. I found myself waiting for her in ways I couldn't explain, listening for her footsteps, craving the sound of her voice. When I went to bed, I would replay every glance, every graze of skin, every moment where our bodies threatened to collapse into each other. My wife slept beside me, her warmth familiar, but no longer enough to smother the fire spreading inside me. I turned away from her in the dark, my thoughts consumed by the younger woman in the next room. The fire lived in me constantly, It burned while I washed dishes, while I folded laundry, while I pretended to be absorbed in conversations that no longer held meaning. Even the simplest tasks were threaded with anticipation, as though at any moment she might appear in the doorway, tilt her head in that way that unraveled me, and step closer until I forgot how to breathe. The flame had grown beyond control, and I was no longer trying to contain it. I was feeding it, quietly, recklessly, with every look I allowed myself, with every moment I stayed too close. By the time I admitted it to myself, the damage was already done. The secret flame wasn't a spark anymore. It was a steady fire consuming the edges of everything I had built. I felt it in my chest, in my blood, in the restless way I dreamed of her touch. And I knew it was only a matter of time before the silence broke, before one of us crossed the line fully. The fire didn't ask for permission. It demanded to be fed. And I was no longer certain I wanted to resist. The morning arrived heavy with silence, as though the house itself carried the weight of the night before. Light streamed in through the blinds, thin and fractured, painting stripes across the sheets that clung to my skin. I woke slowly, my body aching in quiet ways, tender reminders of what had happened hours earlier. For a moment, I lay still, eyes closed, pretending nothing had changed. But the air betrayed me. It was thick, warm, scented faintly of her perfume and the salt of her skin. She was still beside me, her breathing steady, her body sprawled across the bed with careless grace. A strand of hair fell across her face, and I resisted the urge to reach out, to tuck it behind her ear, to let my fingers linger against her cheek. The sheets had slipped low, revealing the curve of her shoulder, bare and glowing in the morning light. My chest tightened at the sight, torn between awe and fear. I wanted to memorize every detail, yet the thought of what it meant made my pulse stumble. I was no longer just a woman with secrets. I had crossed into a life where nothing would ever feel the same again. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake her. The room was filled with the remnants of our intimacy, clothes scattered on the floor, the faint impression of bodies pressed into the mattress, the unmistakable scent of desire hanging in the air. I pressed a hand to my lips, as if trying to seal the memory inside me, but my skin still tingled where hers had touched. Every nerve remembered. My body betrayed me again and again, reminding me of the hunger that had burned through the night. I wondered if she dreamed of it too, if she would wake with the same fire in her veins. Walking to the kitchen, I felt exposed, even though the house was quiet. The tile was cold under my bare feet, grounding me for a moment, but my thoughts refused to settle. I poured coffee into a mug, watching the steam rise, and thought of her lying in my bed. The image was so vivid I nearly dropped the cup. It wasn't guilt that gripped me. It was the dizzying awareness that I didn't regret it. The shame I expected hadn't arrived. In its place was something darker, sharper, impossible to dismiss. When she entered the kitchen, wrapped loosely in a blanket, I froze. She moved with a languid ease, as though the night had been no secret at all, as though she had nothing to hide. Her bare shoulders peeked out from under the fabric, her skin glowing against the morning light, and the sight of her stole the air from my lungs. She poured herself a glass of water, brushing past me, the faint heat of her body grazing mine. My hand trembled as I set down the mug, afraid it would shatter under the weight of my grip. We didn't speak. Words would have ruined it. Instead, the silence itself became the confession. The way she leaned against the counter, the way her eyes lingered on me, the way my body ached to close the gap between us, everything said more than language ever could. I took a sip of coffee, though it had gone cold already, and stared into the dark liquid as if it could offer clarity. It gave none. My reflection in its surface looked foreign, a stranger caught between craving and consequence. The rest of the morning unfolded in fragments. She wandered back to the bedroom, leaving the blanket on the chair, her bare form a fleeting vision that branded itself into my memory. I followed later, unable to resist, and found her curled up on the bed, one arm tucked under her cheek, her lips parted in a faint smile. I stood in the doorway too long, fighting the urge to climb back beside her, to gather her against me and lose myself again. But the weight of reality pressed down, reminding me of the line we had erased. I sat on the edge of the bed, close enough to feel her warmth, far enough to pretend restraint. My hand hovered over her arm, trembling with hesitation, before finally settling gently on her skin. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. No masks, no pretense, no denial. In that gaze lived everything: the hunger, the fear, the dangerous pull neither of us wanted to resist. My throat tightened, my heart pounded, but I didn't move my hand. I couldn't. That was the confession, not spoken aloud, not written in words, but carved into the stillness of the morning. My body admitted what my lips refused to say. Her presence admitted what her drunken whisper had already revealed. And as the sunlight spilled brighter across the room, I knew we had stepped past the point of no return. There would be no forgetting, no undoing. The morning had sealed it. The confession was alive, burning quietly in the space between us, demanding to be carried forward. The morning should have been like any other, but it wasn't. The air in the house felt thick, as though it had soaked up all the secrets of the night and was now pressing them back against my skin. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, staring into its surface until the black liquid looked bottomless. My hands trembled slightly when I lifted it, though I wasn't cold. I knew something had shifted permanently, and no matter how I tried to frame it, there was no way to turn back to the life I had known before. She entered the kitchen first, barefoot, her hair still damp from the shower. She wore one of my shirts, oversized on her small frame, and the sight of it sent a wave of heat through me that I quickly tried to suppress. She moved easily, without hesitation, as though my home already belonged to her. She poured herself water, leaned against the counter, and looked at me with eyes that carried no apology. It was not a confrontation. It was something quieter, heavier, an acknowledgement that silence no longer meant denial. Then came the sound of the front door. My wife's keys clattered against the wooden bowl near the entryway, her familiar footsteps echoing through the hall. I froze, the mug still in my hand, my throat tightening as if I had swallowed glass. The younger woman glanced at me, but didn't move, didn't hide. She remained against the counter, calm, steady, almost defiant. And then my wife entered, her presence filling the kitchen in a way that made every nerve in my body seize. The three of us stood in a triangle of silence. My wife's eyes darted first to me, then to the girl standing in my shirt, then back again. No words passed her lips, but the silence spoke louder than any accusation. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears, my chest heavy with the realization that I had been seen. Yet instead of retreating, instead of finding shame, I felt a strange rush of clarity. The truth was no longer buried. It had risen, raw and undeniable, into the open. What happened next was so small, so devastatingly simple, that it shattered everything. The younger woman reached out, took my hand, and placed it firmly on her thigh. The gesture was deliberate, intentional, and irreversible. My wife's eyes widened just slightly, her lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came. I didn't pull away. My hand remained there, trembling yet steady, a declaration without words. In that single moment, my silence became its own confession. My wife lowered her gaze to the floor, her shoulders stiffening, her breathing shallow but controlled. She didn't storm out, didn't shout, didn't demand answers. She simply turned toward the counter, reached for a glass, and filled it with water. Her movements were measured, deliberate, almost mechanical. I watched her, aching with a guilt that had no remedy, and yet underneath it pulsed the raw heat of desire that refused to fade. The contradiction tore at me, but I couldn't loosen my grip on the hand resting against the younger woman's skin. The kitchen became unbearable with its silence. The clatter of the faucet, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the shuffle of my wife's feet against the tile. These small sounds rang out louder than screams. I realized then that the destruction didn't come with chaos, but with quiet. This was the kind of ending that left no chance of rescue. I had created a fracture that would never mend, a wound that would never heal. And in the middle of it, I remained motionless, tethered to the flame that had already consumed me. As the day stretched on, nothing outwardly changed. My wife went about her routine, moving through the house with a stiff grace that broke my heart more than rage ever could. The younger woman lingered by my side, her touch steady, her gaze unwavering. Meals were eaten in silence, rooms were shared without conversation, but everything was different now. The truth had bled into every corner, staining the walls, the furniture, the very air we breathed. There was no salvaging what had been lost. At night, I lay awake between them, my wife on one side of the bed, her back turned to me, her breathing shallow and restless. The younger woman on the other side, her body pressed against mine, her hand on my stomach, her warmth seeping into me. I felt trapped in the strangest way, not caught by circumstance, but caught by choice. I had stepped willingly into the fire, and now I burned in it, unable to escape, unwilling to stop. My wife's silence was the cruelest punishment, but her refusal to leave was even worse. She stayed, she endured, and her presence became a mirror of my betrayal. The ending wasn't dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no violent goodbyes. It was worse than that. It was the slow suffocation of knowing that the life I had once built was now infected, irrevocably tainted, and that I would continue to live inside it. Each day, each night, I would see my wife's eyes and feel her silence pressing down on me, even as I surrendered again and again to the heat of the younger woman's body. It was a prison of my own making, a cycle without escape. And that was the final cruelty. There was no salvation waiting, no redemption to be found. Only this, the endless collision of guilt and desire, shame and hunger, loyalty and betrayal. I had chosen the flame, and now I carried it with me, a secret no longer secret, a truth no longer hidden, a wound no longer capable of healing. It lived in me, in the walls of the house, in the bed where we all lay together. This was the ending without salvation, and I had no choice but to keep breathing inside it.